Is that everyone hear me? Okay, cool. Okay. So yes, as Chris mentioned, I am a very capable graduate student. I am a very new graduate student. So this system is very new to me, and I have notes, and that's all to say, please be nice to me. So some of this information is probably familiar to many of you, but I think it's really good to revisit this in the context of grasslands. So ecosystem services can be broken up into these 4 main categories. We have our regulating services, and those are the things that create and maintain favorable conditions for humans. And in grasslands, we can think about this as like pollination and pest and parasite suppression. Supporting services are those that are foundational conditions upon which all of the other services depend. And this is things like soil formation, nutrient cycling, and habitat provisioning, which is related to biodiversity, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Our provisioning services are those that contribute directly and materially to humans, and this can be things like food and water. I put silk up there. Obviously, grasslands aren't providing that, but we can think about maybe honey. And then we have our cultural services. This is underrepresented across the board, but we can maybe think about bird watching and how insects actually support that cultural service. So biodiversity, as I mentioned on the last slide, is foundational to ecosystem function. And ecological functions tend to increase with increasing diversity. And we can see this visualized in this graph by Hooper et al. So on the bottom, we have number of species, of plant species, and then on the y-axis, we have plant biomass. And we see this kind of trend going with increase in plant biomass as we have more species. But we can think about this as a variety of ecosystem processes. You could replace that y-axis with things like nutrient uptake by plants, or predation, or pollination, or decomposition rates. We're going to still have that general upward trend. And ecosystem services are the subset of ecological functions that we find useful. And that can be quantified in terms of things like species richness, which Chris talked about, diversity, functional and trait diversity, and genetic or phylogenetic diversity. Generally, our hypothesis is that having more species available to perform a function, the better it's going to be. So I want to talk a little bit about beneficial insects in forage grasslands. Oh, did it take that long? So first of all, things that you can look for in your forage grasslands include parasitoid wasps. These guys are natural enemies of pests. They can develop inside dung-breeding flies, specific species that is, and they're usually quite small, only like 1 to 3 millimeters in length. And they're very easy to overlook, but if you actually get close and look at the surface of a dung pat, you can see them moving around. They might be entering holes that other insects have made in the crust of a dung pat, and they're looking for hosts for their larvae. Ants are another very important insect in forage grasslands. They have many, many direct and indirect effects. They can change the composition of the soil. And I'm going to briefly explain this weird graph, but our image. At the top, we have our ants, and then on the left, we have honey-producing insects like aphids. So ants will protect aphids because they consume the honeydew, and then in that behavior, they also prevent herbivores and predators from getting to the plants. So they end up having both a direct and indirect positive effect on plants. And in temperate grasslands, they can act as both a consumer and an ecosystem engineer because their nest construction and associated soil movement influences that invertebrate, plant, and soil microbial diversity and can potentially alter grassland productivity because they can increase that soil drainage, the aeration, and the nutrient quality. So there's many beetles that are very beneficial to forage grasslands, but I'm just going to touch on these two kind of as they relate to livestock dung. So we have ground beetles. They're great for preying on slugs and aphids and mites and other pest species. And then, of course, we have dung beetles, which are probably most well known for their contributions to dung decomposition and their assistance in controlling dung-breeding flies. So there's various other ecosystem services that they provide. They can help reduce methane. They compete with nuisance flies for resources. They can break up parasitic life cycles. They can reduce pasture fouling. They can create macropores, which I'll talk more about in the research that our lab is conducting. And they can deliver nutrients and organic matter below the surface. And so we typically break these guys up into 3 main categories based off of their functional traits. And a functional trait is any measurable characteristic that an individual has. This can be a variety of things, but maybe like morphological or behavioral trait. And that affects either its fitness, the fitness of other individuals or other species, and it can also affect abiotic ecosystem processes. And changes in certain ecosystem functions group is if we lose an entire functional group, we typically believe that's worse than if we lost a couple of species across multiple functional groups. And for dung beetles, their groups are often defined by how they are actually using and disrupting dung, specifically their nesting and reproductive behavior. So the first functional group that we have are dwellers. These guys are really small. They're usually only a half a centimeter in length. And they will find the manure, they will eat it, and lay their eggs within that actual dung pat. And they can improve decomposition rates because they're breaking up all of that dung, and that's aerating it and potentially reducing methane. We have tunneler species. These guys create tunnels directly below the dung pat, and they can be important in dung removal, but probably not as much as roller species. These guys are typically found in lower latitudes. They're very charismatic. And they transport a ball of dung away from the pat before they bury it shallowly, and they will reform it into their brood balls. And they can remove a lot of dung. They're usually medium to large size. They need that size to be able to transport the dung. And this, interestingly, may improve seed germination as they're taking those seeds away from that dung pat and they're just burying it below the surface. So here's just an image of kind of what this could look like. We have all these different types of nesting strategies, which would be like different species. We have rollers on the left side. You can see it's just kind of barely below the surface. And then we have our dwellers moving around in the actual pat. And then we have all these different types of nesting strategies for tunnelers. And if we kind of look more closely at this, I want to talk about their actual life cycle. So a male and female will form a pair bond, and they will build their nest below that actual fresh dung pat. They'll tunnel beneath and put their dung balls in there, which are these images on the left. I mean, that's a roller species, but you can kind of visualize what a ball of dung would look like. And then they build these nests, and inside of that dung ball, they put an egg on a pedestal, which has a bunch of nutrients. When that larva hatches out, they'll consume those nutrients, and then they'll eat the brood ball from the inside out. So I've given a very general overview of their biology. I want to transition to talking about what we're actually conducting in Dr. Haan's lab. And so one of the things that farmers and, as a result, our lab is interested in is how do dung beetles change soil properties. And I showed this image earlier on the ecosystem service slide. So they create these holes in the soil, and that allows for water and nutrients to actually move through. And considering that cattle poop a lot, if we understand better how we could improve this filtration and this movement within the soil, we can improve soil conditions. So he started off, sorry, it's very delayed. Okay. So he started off by looking at this with a compaction gradient. We wanted to see how livestock might be compacting the soil and making it difficult for dung beetles to excavate. So he used this compactor across a section of land at Elmwood Stock Farm in Kentucky. And in each of those gradient sections, he put 3 buckets. One had nothing in it, the other bucket had dung only, and then the third bucket had dung beetles that he added. It was Onthophagus taurus, which is an exotic species, but it was the only species at Elmwood Stock Farm. And he put this exclusion net over it so that nothing else could get in. And 4 months later, he came back to look at this and to test the saturation conductivity, which is this little drawing here. We have this metal cylinder that he put in the buckets. He filled it with water and saw how quickly the water moved through the soil. And you can see what the results are here. We have our control, our dung only, and the dung plus beetles. and adding those beetles to the buckets increased the conductivity by 3.5 times. There was no significant interaction with the compaction gradient, so dung beetles are very strong and they can actually dig through when the soils are heavily compacted. And so the next step is going to be modeling large-scale soil transformation in pasture systems. This experiment was with a single cow pat, so we really want to see how this would look at a landscape scale. And if we can look at how water is stored in the pasture, and often we think about large amounts of water early in the season, not enough water later in the season. If pastures can act like a sponge and hold all those nutrients in the water, then that can be really beneficial for pasture land. So the next project we have going on is there's a lot of research on landscape ecology in the context of pollinators, but the literature's more sparse when it comes to dung beetles. So Holly, she's a PhD student in Haan's lab, wanted to look at how landscape structure shapes dung beetle communities. And the way she did this was she wanted to test dung beetles across a gradient from pasture, so no forest cover, all the way up to a full forest. And her hypothesis was that the landscape would modulate communities indirectly by shaping the dung distribution. And you can see in this graph here, we have proportion of forest cover on the bottom there from 0 to 100%, and then the diversity, Hills-Shannon diversity on the y-axis. And she found that diversity was unaffected across that gradient of forest cover. We had just as many different types of species in the open pasture as there were in the forested areas. However, the composition was very different. In the open pasture, we had lots of exotic species, primarily Ornithophagous taurus, and then in the forest area, there was no exotic species, and it was these like more fun, rare native species, such as the one on the right. And so she's currently working on gut content analysis as well as pesticide quantification. So next up, we have Madison. She's working on how livestock dewormers alter dung beetle community structure and what roles does the individual's behavior play in driving these patterns. Something that's in the literature a lot is that dung beetles are actually attracted to parasiticides, and so she wanted to look at how this might vary across different deworming treatments, those being ivermectin, moxidectin, and I can't pronounce it, epronomectin, right? Okay. So she did this out in the field. She did pitfall trapping and was able to quantify, or excuse me, she had it over a course of different days. Her methods changed a little bit between the years. We have 7 and 14 days that she checked, and then in 2025, she checked across a 30-day span, and there was no difference between the community structure in any of the treatments. But there was this like weird little bump in 2025 at 7 days, and so she's looking to see what that might have been. It could have been a precipitation event or something else. So next thing she wanted to look at was, does dung beetle attraction differ between deworming treated and controlled dung in choice arenas? And what this was is she took a petri dish, she put dung that was treated with a specific dewormer on one side, and then there was nothing on the other side. She dropped a beetle in there, it would move around for 20 minutes, and she would track it with a video camera. And what she found was there was no significant preference between the treatments. But when she tested it with a control, so she used a positive control, which was DEET, and she used negative control, which was untreated dung, she found that there was a possible preference for ivermectin-containing dung during those behavioral assays. So next, she's going to be looking at the chemical cues. She's doing some olfactory and antinogram stuff to look at seeing what is actually attracting them to these dewormers. And finally, what I plan to do, I'm interested in movement ecology generally, and so we want to know how dung beetles are actually tracking dung resources. How far can they fly? Are they actually going along with the herd? And I'm going to be looking at this in both bison and cattle out in Nebraska. And we also want to know, does the exposure to non-lethal doses of parasiticides affect their ability to disperse? And with that, I'd just like to thank you all for being here.